want to talk about the pandemic today because my sense is that in the pandemic we have had certain things thrust upon our lives that have caused all of us a certain level of problems and frustrations. I mean, you think about it a year ago, none of us could have imagined a scenario in which our lives would have been so disrupted. But most everyone that I've interacted with over this last stretch of time, at one point or another, has experienced anxiety or depression or frustration at a level and in a way that we just simply haven't experienced it before. I mean, I've observed these things over the last several months, and so have you. We have any number of people in this room today, for example, who had to be quarantined. Some people more than once, and I don't want to be quarantined again. So when I don't hug you, part of it's selfish. I don't want to be quarantined again. And look at me, I don't want to be quarantined again. I just don't. That's not my idea of a good time. I have a friend who the entire family is currently quarantined and picked up COVID on a trip. And so, I mean, this has just been a frustration beyond what we could have imagined. So what I want to do today is try to address some of the more common frustrations that I've observed over this time, and see if we can find in this discussion some sense of what God might be saying to His people. I mean, my goal today is to help all of us combat some of these really trying, frustrating realities. I mean, the disruptions have been significant, and our concerns are legitimate. So let me start by saying this. I don't believe God's people need to operate the same as everybody else. We can't be business as usual, even in this season. I think we got to learn how to better access the things that the Father is providing to His church during this season. And I think, and you can back me up on this, I think in many ways the church is being watched. And I mean the church corporately, and I mean Christians individually. People are watching to see how we're going to handle it. If we're going to lose our religion over one more change in our schedule or one more frustration. If you cuss, just remember that it is one of my maxims that I don't trust a Christian who doesn't cuss just a little bit. So it doesn't mean you've lost your faith. So you can recover from it. But let me just say, I think we're being watched. In fact, it may mean that because of our humanity showing a little bit, and we've been frustrated by quarantines and social distancing and masks and everything else that goes along with it, it may mean because we've felt the brunt of that and maybe at times buckled under the weight of that pressure, that we can be people who speak to it with authority about the peace that we can find even in the midst of the pandemic. We need to know this clearly. God has not abandoned us. And I personally do not believe that He is silent at this time. I think He's present in the frustration, and I believe that He is very willing and very active in providing for us extra resources to strengthen us so that we can stand strong in a season that's testing all of us. So I come today to speak about some of these more obvious challenges that many of us are facing and to see if we can find a better sense of God's provision. I want you to walk out of here today feeling a little more encouraged and strengthened in all of that. I have a picture to prove this if Cal will put that up, but I recently went to South Padre Island for a much-needed vacation. I think you can tell I was pretty excited to be somewhere other than Brownwood for a few days. One of the surprises to me, and I watched it on the Weather Channel, I thought, well, that can't be right. When it was 100, and this is the week that it was running in the hundreds here, right, a couple of weeks ago. When it was 105 here, middle of the day, it was 85 on Padre Island. Some of you know that from how all that climate stuff works. And I was surprised that the Gulf of Mexico was kind of cold. When you stepped into knee-deep water, that's about all you wanted, because I got in over my head a few times, and that wasn't fun. Kind of took my breath away because it was cold. But it was great to wade around in the water and watch the parasailers, and they had guys on jet skis pulling people on these big, long, that looked like a giant hot dog, and they were riding on it all over the place. And I mean, it was just good to be in a different spot, and it was middle of the week, and it was past the 4th of July. It wasn't very crowded. ate some very good seafood, and Josh and I just had a good time. And one of my favorite things, because I'm typically more of a mountain guy than a beach guy, but we went to the beach, and so one of my favorite things was to go down to the beach at sunset, watch the sun, just watch it get dark. And I went for the sunrise one morning too. That's where the direction of that ocean was. But go down there at night, walk around. One night I had on a long sleeve shirt and I needed it. It was so cool. It was fantastic. Not to rub it in, but it was great. And walk along the beach. But one of the things I noticed was when you walk out on the sand, most of the sand is so compacted that it's like walking on pavement, right? You know that. It's smooth, and so you walk around and you get out a little ways, and then you go down, and then you find another sandbar, and you go back up, and you're out there 200 yards, but it's only about that deep. And Josh was playing around on a boogie board, and I was walking around. But a handful of times in 4 days of doing this, I would be standing, on that sand that had been pretty compacted, whatever. I'd be standing there, and all of a sudden, the sand beneath my feet would just start crumbling, and I would just start sinking down. At first, it was a little frightening. I thought, maybe I'm going down into the abyss of the ocean or something, or some creature's pulling me in. I don't know. But then I got used to it. So just every once in a while, you get to a certain place, you'd stand there, and your feet would just start, it would just kind of crumble, and you just got to sink down, maybe to about mid-cap. It'd sink pretty far. Listen, one of the things that we're experiencing is that those things that are normally very, very compacted and very level paths and very sturdy place to stand, that we're used to being something that we can stand on, it's crumbling beneath our feet. Our schedules, whether or not the church is open, is school going to happen? If it does happen, what's going to happen? Is it going to be an outbreak when our kids go? Should they go online? Should we buy school supplies yet? What about my business? What about my job? I've been working at home for 4 months. I've got friends in that situation. Stuff that normally is just, our schedules and our things that are predictable for us are at some level like security blankets for us, aren't they? Who would have thought? I just wouldn't have ever imagined being a career school teacher that we would close our schools. I'm like, that is crazy. But we did. And, how do you make things happen during all of this? So the places that we normally would have had very solid footing have been crumbling beneath our feet. And it's an uneasy feeling. For some of us, it was okay for a while, and then it started catching up to us. Right? Any of you like that? You got through the first wave, but when the second wave came, and then the third wave, and when they made the fifth change, and, it just, after a while, it's like, I'm ready to stand on something that it won't move under my feet. And we've been kind of like that. So, listen, I want to ask some questions today. And here are the questions. What are the more common challenges of the pandemic, and where is God in all of it? How can we better recognize His voice? And how do we as God's people really learn to operate in faith during uncertain and changing times? So I'll tell you a story. One of my best friends growing up was a guy named Stacy Stanberry. He was an incredible athlete. We played baseball together in the summers growing up, and then in high school, varsity baseball. He was an incredible track athlete, and I used to go over and hang out. He was always at my house. I was always at his house from about 7th through 9th grade. We had a 3-year stretch. And so there were many days I was in his living room. I still remember, can see it very vividly, this one particular day when I sat down and had a conversation with his stepdad. They called him Dio, and I was talking to Dio. And when I was talking to him, I noticed he had a scar on his head, and he had a bad scar on his wrist. And I just said to him, how'd you get that scar? And he said, well, sit down, I'll tell you a story. And he told me one of the most remarkable stories I've ever heard in my life. And here's the story. He said, I was working on a construction site. We were on about the 5th or 6th floor in a building that was, a tall building that was being built in the Dallas area. And he said, my job was on that day to stand on the edge of the building with a walkie-talkie, and I was talking to the crane operators because we had a very heavy piece of equipment, and one crane had the front end of the equipment, and the other crane was attached by cable to the back end, and they were bringing it up, and my job was just to try to keep them level. And he said they got about halfway up that building, and he said one of the cranes started having trouble, and I'm talking to him, and we're trying to get it. and the engine froze or burned out or something, and that part of the equipment just dropped. And when it did, the cable snapped, and when the cable snapped, it came backlashing back up and wrapped around his body and threw him off the building. Now, he said 5 or 6 stories. He landed on top of a car and bounced into the street. First, they call the paramedics. Paramedics show up. They can't find a pulse. His head's cracked open. His wrist is folded backwards and broken. One of his legs is broken, all crooked. He's in bad shape. And they call for a paramedic, and then they determine there's no pulse. And they call a coroner, and a coroner comes out to the scene because you have a dead body. And he stands over D.O., and he's examining him, and he looks at somebody, and he says, "What happened to this guy?" Some guys told D.O. this later, some of his co-workers. And he said, "Well, he flew off of that building right there." So the coroner gets out a death certificate and signs it. Hours later, you can imagine, he's in the morgue, and when he began to move and make noise, it kind of disturbed the person that was moving the dead bodies around in the morgue. And they call for somebody, and they come and get him, and they find out he's alive. And they take him to ICU, and he's in a coma for days and days and days. And sometime after he woke up from the coma, a doctor came in and just said, "Dio, you're very lucky to be alive. We guess maybe that car that you landed on top of broke your fall just enough to not just destroy all your internal organs, and we can't believe you're here." And he showed him his own death certificate signed by a licensed physician. Now I'm sitting in his living room thinking, this is the wildest story I've ever heard in my life. But here's the fun part. I said, what did you think when you were flying off the top of that 6-story building? He said, "Oh, I don't know." He said, "But if I'd known I was going to be sitting here talking to you today, I probably would have enjoyed the flight." I got something to tell you. COVID may not be any fun. It may be frustrating, irritating, anxious, depression-causing, all of those things. But one day, you're going to be sitting in a living room telling somebody about COVID-19. And you might as well learn right now how to enjoy the flight. And quit fighting and kicking and screaming and cussing and saying, "I don't want to wear a mask. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. It's messed up all my schedule." You could do that if you want to. Just go right ahead. You can kick and scream all you want. All you're going to do is, send out more carbon monoxide into the air. It's not going to help you. Right? So, listen. You are going to survive the coronavirus. You're going to survive the pandemic. You might as well learn how to enjoy the ride. So point number 1 is this. Learn how to enjoy the ride. Because the mark of a believer is not that they're in a good mood and life is wonderful and they're able to feel victorious when everything is working out exactly the way they want it to and the way it's always been before. The mark of the believer is the one whose life has been turned upside down and still they can be joyful right in the middle of it. Are you with me? Because happiness is one of those things, right? Happiness always turns up in all of the places that we would suspect it to be. You got a promotion at work, your house got paid off, all your kids are happy, your marriage is going great, you've got a vacation plan, there's plenty of money in the bank, you're feeling good. That's where happiness lives. But joy is just as unpredictable as the one who gave birth to it. Jesus was unpredictable, right? He said to Jesus one time, "Lazarus is dying." He says, "Okay, well, let's stay over here 3 more days." Right? Why don't you go talk to him now? "Lord, we're going to the temple." "I don't want to go to the temple." He goes, "Later." Jesus was, "Where are you going?" "I'm going across the other side of the lake." "Why are you going over there?" "Well, why not?" Jesus was unpredictable. And his joy is like that. It shows up in places where it doesn't seem to belong. And so if we're going to walk through this with some sense of victory and some sense of our witness intact about the fact that despite that we're dealing with all of the struggles of the pandemic, that we are in relationship with a resurrected Savior who reigns over all things, including pandemics, then we have got to be God's people and have His Spirit living in us. Our community is watching us, and we need joyful people. Think about Paul in Philippians 4, which he wrote from jail, by the way. He says, "I'm not saying this out of need, for I have learned to be content regardless of my circumstances." There's There's our marching orders. I'm going to learn to be content, joyful, happy, somehow in a good mood, making it through this regardless of my circumstances. See? But we got all these things going on. I'm a little weary of all the discussion about masks. I don't know about you, but I could live the rest of my life and not talk again about a mask. Anybody else? It's just, But on my trip, and some of these pictures aren't the ones, but on my trip, I just got curious. Everywhere I went, they had different kinds of, some of them tried to be real pleasant, They tried to say something funny to get you to wear their mask in the store, which, by the way, in South Padre, everybody wore masks. I didn't go anywhere, not one time, in any building that all the people weren't wearing a mask. They were serious about it down there in the valley. I don't know what that was about, but they were. So, a little bit of mask humor. So, before we get to the mask humor, I want to show you a picture of something like, how would you do an infant baptism during the midst of the coronavirus? You do it like this. I think they posed for the picture and then they did a real baptism, but you don't have to get the baby that wet anyway. You're just sprinkling, so just shoot them with a little squirt gun. We kind of joked when coronavirus started, like, we'll do baptisms. We'll just turn on the water hose out here in the street and you can drive by on a bicycle and squirt you down as you go by. Just bless you, Jesus, go. Being tongue-in-cheek, don't get offended. And then I am curious about the mask thing because there's some humor. So the next picture shows this. That's a bank, by the way. Please don't wear a ski mask into the bank. Wear the other mask. And then I appreciated Mike and the guys down at the Pioneer at the Tap House. They're putting a mask on their buffalo. I think the elk has one too. So somehow we gotta make it. But I saw this, and I'm told that Jonathan Dunlap has coined the phrase, and Scott Coors had it on his Facebooks where I first saw it. And it's this. It's true for all of us, right? Scott wrote, today I'm riding on the back of the struggle bus. We've all been on the struggle bus, right? I mean, this thing has knocked us sideways. My mom's in a nursing home. I haven't seen her since February. I have a friend in college whose dad died in a nursing home. He wasn't allowed to go see him. This was back in like April in the first parts. And so, the beat goes on and on and on. But somehow, we've got to learn to enjoy the ride. What'd you think, Dio? If I'd known I was going to be sitting here today, I would have enjoyed the flight. Listen, you're going to be sitting there. You're going to survive this thing. You might as well figure out a way to enjoy it. Secondly, this. The thing that I've noticed that's really hard for a lot of people is that we're having to take a more flexible approach to our planning. Okay? If you're a planner, like you have a Dayminder and you have a phone app and you like to plan, and then plan some more, raise your hand. Planners with a capital P. Okay, let me just say this. That's a gift. I don't have it. We need you. You're very important to us. But also right now, all of us right now should get on our knees and pray for those people because this is driving them absolutely crazy. I mean, normally they could structure their day and they got, these are people that, have their next grocery order for 2 months from now already written out. I mean, they're planned. Right? They know what they're going to do at Christmas at noon. I mean, and we need people that know how to plan like that. That's not how I roll. I'm thinking, what day is it? I have to look at my phone. I mean, I kind of just function in the moment. When I taught school, it's like, what does it matter what day it is? I'm doing the same thing every day anyway. So you teachers know that. So, but here's what I want to say about that. We've got to figure out how to take a more flexible approach to planning. And I think there's a spiritual component to how we plan our time. So let me get to that. I've been reading a new book. It's called Resilience. I didn't have any about 3 weeks ago, so I thought I'd buy a book and read a book on resilience, see if it would help me. Okay, Resilience. It's by a counselor, an author named Linda Graham. Here's what she says. Whenever something challenging happens, we have the power and the flexibility to choose how we will respond to it, right? She said, but the shift for us that we need to develop more resilience is that when something bad happens, we should stop and think. Listen to this. Maybe this problem is something that needed to happen in my life. Let me slow down and let that sink in. That's like a shot. If you don't like shots, that's like, right? Maybe this problem needed to happen to get me to see something that I otherwise would have missed. It's a shift. So there's a spiritual approach to how things flow. I want you to remember this. If you're a note taker, you should write this down. Our lives and our schedules ultimately belong to God. Plan all you want. Write it down in blood if you want to. Your schedule, what goes on in your life, you were bought with a price. Your schedule belongs to God. Okay? And so, one of the things we got to figure out to do is that there is, for all of us, a spiritual component to how we plan, what we prioritize, the way we go about it, how flexible we are or not, what we think of, because there are going to be times when you're going to have your day planned, and in the middle of the day, God's going to hijack your day, and you're going to think, what the heck, I had this plan, I wanted my day to go exactly like it was planned, and He hijacks your plan just so that you can be in the right line at Walmart at the right moment to talk to somebody who really needs to hear what God has put in your heart. Are you with me? You carry precious cargo, and sometimes your plans are just going to get messed up. It's like, I don't know what the theological word is for God messing with me, but sometimes God messes with me. Does He mess with you? See? So it's important. Now, where will we get a scripture for this? James chapter 4. Listen to what he says. Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Listen, those of you that say that. Why, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, notice here's the shift. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. Now, you got to figure out what the shift is. But if you're a planner and all of this, disruption to our normal flow, like crumbling sand beneath our feet, where you can normally walk, now you can't walk there because it doesn't make any sense. Somewhere in the midst of that, the shift is you got to incorporate this kind of spiritual component. If it is the Lord's will, then we will do this or that. And if your schedule gets messed up, then you got to be looking that God might be doing something else. I think it's important not to be flippant about our schedules. I think those of us that are not as big on scheduling, we need to meet our scheduling friends halfway. Those of you that are planners can say amen, because it's important to do that. But I've been saying all along that the pandemic of 2020 is the germaphobe's worst nightmare. I got friends that, I'm like, why are you washing your hands again? You just did it 20 times a minute ago, right? I have family like that. Wash it. Like, it's the germaphobe, but it's also the planners, the schedulers, the organized people. It is their worst nightmare because it shifts them in ways. So we got to find a way to do that. So I can't help but believe, I want you to hear this now, I can't help but believe that we're having to learn some things in this season, okay, that are not about this season, but will be very useful in the seasons to come. How many of you know sometimes what's happening today is not about today? It's about down the road. God's doing something now, and then down the road, He's going to call it back up, and it'll make sense. I have to believe that some of the things we're having to learn and adjust to in this season are going to be very useful in the seasons to come. So we got to find a way to do that. So it's kind of like, what are we facing today that is not really about today? And then number 3 is this. We got to figure out a way to live with a consistent sense of peace. I want to tell you today that in spite even my own struggles and frustration, and there are people in this room that have seen me, I tell you, I've been frustrated at times in the midst of this. I'm like, you mean to tell me I got to quarantine again? Like, good night. Just hold me down and shoot me. I mean, it's been like that a little bit. I mean, people have seen it, right? Okay? But in the midst of this, I just want to say this. We can trust Him. In the midst of this crazy circumstance, we can trust Him. And I think we can find ways to cultivate peace. Kind of grow more peace. Kind of learn to live for longer stretches of time in God's peace, even in the midst of circumstances that are frustrating and hard to deal with. See? Because here's what I think is also kind of true. Hear me out here. I know we're about done. I think some of what we're experiencing in our sense of anxiety for many of us is not something that's being caused by the pandemic, but it's being revealed by the pandemic. It's been there all along. You've been anxious long before the pandemic came about certain kinds of things. See? That's pretty good. I'm not even a psychologist. That's pretty good, right? See? It's just given a climate in which it could come to the surface. And while it's in the surface, you know what you got to do with it? Deal with it. And say, God, help me with this. I just feel anxious. I can't sleep. This whole thing about how all this is going on. So the pandemic hasn't caused the anxiety. It's unearthed anxiety that was already brooding down deep in our souls and our spirits somewhere. And we don't want to carry around anxieties because anxieties can choke out the voice of the Father, and we need to hear His voice. So in preparing for this, one of the things I said, like, God, where's something in your Word? And we're going to look at a little bit of Psalm 37, and you're fixing to hear Psalm 37. But one of the things I decided was, by far, I am not the only one dealing with this, and I'm not the one in the room having to deal with this at the highest level. There are many of you dealing with it at a more direct, intense, high level than I am. And so what I decided to do was recruit some help. So I asked my good friend Kim Bruton and her son Atticus and Alex Bingham, our youth director, if they wouldn't mind sitting down on camera and talking a little bit about two questions. What are some things that have been hard about the pandemic, all right? And where have you seen God in that? So I want you to take a moment and really hear and be ministered to the things that they shared very honestly.
So what has been difficult in this season? How much time do we have? Every way I turn to try to find direction, it goes away. So there's been days I don't even want to get out of bed. I don't even want to face the day. And just because it seems like every time I make a move, it's wrong, or the ground underneath me just gets shaken and the rug gets pulled out because we don't know what's next. Now, where I found hope and what God has just taught me through this, He was here before COVID, He's here in the midst of it, and He's going to be here after it.
The Lord makes firm the steps of the one who delights in Him. Though he may stumble, he will not fail, for the Lord upholds him with His hand.
I was young, and now I'm old. Yet I have never seen the righteous forsaken.
The blameless spend their days under the Lord's care.
Some of the things that have been hard during this season, for me here at the train, just the total lack of the order that I depend on to kind of ground me. I feel like so much of my time is spent on the CDC website trying to figure out what the regulations are for today. I don't know, it's kind of been a beating. I remember I looked back and I remember closing on Good Friday and thinking, wow, we made it. My paycheck protection program funded that day, and I thought, we got this. We're gonna make it. And that was so early on. I thought that was it. I thought we'd made it. And I look up and 4.5 months have gone by. And where'd it go? I have a senior this year, I have a junior, I have a sophomore all at home. And it's just something has to give, Where has God been at work in the midst of this? Everywhere. He's everywhere. Early on, especially with just notes in the mail every day from people, I had notes of encouragement. People sent checks saying, hey, this is what I would have spent at your establishment this month. So amidst all this chaos and disorder and changing guidelines and changing food costs and changing availability, and the kingdom's not in trouble.